podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to Away the Podcast. My name is Martin Wanless and today we're bringing you another episode of On This Week, where we take a journey back in time and relive some of the key events that took place on this week in the history of Sunderland AFC. Helping me to do that today, of course, is the regular On This Week lineup. First of all, it's Chris Wynn. How are you, mate?
I'm good. Looking forward to getting into another week of Sunderland AFC history, and I'm also looking forward, of course, to a few of Kelvin's one-liners. We've already had about 3 before we even started recording, so he's getting warmed up.
We didn't press the button early enough, did we? Comedy gold that will never, ever, ever be broadcast beyond these 4 walls.
He'll just have to recreate it.
That's right. Pressure's on now, Kelvin, and as everyone might have guessed, Kelvin's with us again.
Morning, chaps.
Hello. And also joining us, Kelvin's giving us the fingers now. It's lucky this is just an audio medium. We could release a video one day, couldn't we? Andrew Smithson's with us too. How are you, Andrew?
Not bad, thanks, yeah. As Chris says, a couple of good stories this week and Kelvin's ready to go. So, yeah, shaping up to be a good one with any luck.
It is. Now, I've got to stop us here because we've had some feedback.
Right.
So I think, thank you for Tim on Spotify for sharing this with us, because Tim won the competition, which there wasn't a prize for, but it was a competition to spot a couple of deliberate mistakes last week. So well done, Tim. He did spot that Lionel Perez had actually saved a penalty. Can anyone remember the game that it was?
Well, I saw the comment, so I'm not going to guess.
It wasn't Everton, was it?
It was Everton in 1996. And he saved it. I think we won 3-1 that game, didn't we? He saved it just after half-time. Can anyone remember who he saved the penalty from? Who took it?
Oh, I don't know this.
No.
Was it
Who
Tim
was the
Cahill?
It wasn't. No.
I was going to say
He would have scored it.
Gary Speed, maybe? No? Did they have a fullback who used to take penalties?
Are you thinking of Michael? Was it Michael Ball? Or was that a bit too early for him?
Love changes everything.
What was the name of the correspondent there, Martin? Has he given you this bit of extra info, or
no? Tim didn't give me this info. I went and looked for it.
Ah, okay, good work.
Just to throw one in here at the start.
You flummoxed us.
It was Graham Stewart.
Oh, was he still there? Bloody hell.
I
would have thought he'd gone by then.
So Lionel did save a penalty, so sorry, Lionel. And 3 points for a win came in, as Tim correctly points out, in the early 80s, not the late 70s.
It did.
So there we go. Well, it was interesting when I was looking at this, because obviously we do our things properly here. We verify the feedback that we get, not just taking it at face value. And I hadn't realised that 3 points for a win, while it became standard in England in the 80s, it wasn't until after Italia 90 that became kind of standard across European leagues as well. It hadn't really caught on in Europe until after Italia 90. So that was an interesting thing. So I wouldn't have known that if Tim hadn't pointed that out. So, yeah, thank you very much, Tim. And last week, Andrew has always left us with a couple of clues as to somebody who we're going to mention today. And I think we're going to mention this person in passing. We're not going to do a whole segment on him, are we, Andrew?
No, as I said, we're going to have to be a little bit creative over the next couple of months with it being post-season. The clues were that this fellow was born in North Carolina. He also passed away in North Carolina in 2018. He had, however, made 8 appearances at Roker Park in 1984, and that was the trick element to the question, because he wasn't a player. Any clues? Any guesses, rather? Kelvin, I think you had a good idea, didn't you?
I haven't got a prayer of getting this one.
Yes, it was I think it's fair to say he was world famous, an evangelist called Billy Graham, who did 8 nights worth of performances at Roker Park in the 80s. Yeah. As I say, bit unfair of me, that one. Bit of a googly. From what I've found out, Billy Graham actually did a tour of several football grounds that summer. It was part of a talk he was doing called Mission England. And as well as Roker Park, he was at Anfield that year, Villa Park, Ashton Gate, and then Portman Road and Carroll Road. So maybe he had a lot of supporters down in that part of the world. Pretty big event. There was over 1 million people attended these talks he did. The one at Roker Park, which was the first night of which was on the 26th of May, which is why it falls into this week, there was over 16,000 people in the stadium. And when you compare that to the attendance for the most recent home game, which was against Notts County, there was actually 2,000 people more that turned up to come and see Billy Graham than Len Ashurst's team. So he was obviously a popular fella, and seemingly this was the biggest single religious meeting in the Northeast since Graham had been at Newcastle City Hall way back in 1946. So, yeah, I expect a few groans for that trick question, but interesting nonetheless, and just a bit of a unusual event that happened at Roker Park back in the day.
You can't imagine that sort of thing happening now, can you?
No, I mean, the whole size of this event is massive. As I say, over 1 million people across these various nights. It's not something that would happen in England now, I don't think. I assume in America you do get these types of rallies, but not a common occurrence for us.
So more people are interested in Jesus' saves than Chris Turner's saves.
Very good. I thought Kelvin might have had a punchline for this.
Jesus saves, but Gabbiadini nets the rebound.
That's right. Well, I actually had that line in for this next little bit because on the same day as this, 7 years earlier, Gary Rowell became the first Sunderland player to play for England under 21s. He came on as a sub and he played alongside Peter Reid in that game. And I had jotted down Jesus saves, but Rowell nets a rebound. So there you go. On the 27th of May in 2009, Ellis Short took full control of the club from Drummondville, while 20-odd years back from there, in 1996, Peter Reid was preparing his squad for the Premier League, or the Premiership as it was, I think, at the time. In Reid's first full season, we'd won the Championship, of course, after he'd rescued us from relegation. And obviously this is early on in the summer transfer windows, but already the wheels were in motion preparing the squad for, an attempt to stay up in the Premiership. On this week in 1996, there were a few interesting transfer rumours. We'd been linked with the Man City pair of Keith Curle and Niall Quinn, both of which had been strenuously denied by Reid in the papers. So whether that was to put people off the scent, because of course Quinn almost went to a club in Singapore, wasn't it? Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So there was obviously something going on there. And, Keith Curle would have been an interesting signing at that point, because I think defensively we were probably a little bit short that season.
I was just going to say, with the Man City, there was Uwe Rosler was linked every other day, wasn't he, during that summer?
He was, yeah. He was one who kept, his name kept cropping up, didn't he? Because I think we were really after a striker and a goalkeeper. I think they were the key positions I had really identified. Because he was going all out for Shea Given. And actually, on last Friday, I did a piece on the website about that chase for Shea Given, because Reid had said he'd put down so much money, as much money as Blackburn wanted, really, and Blackburn just hard no, didn't want to sell him, which was unfortunate because he would have been a great signing for us and could have changed the whole course of history. But we'll not linger on that too much. But Bogdan Stelia had also been linked with us. He was a Romanian goalkeeper. And on the back page of the Sunderland Echo on the 27th of May in 1996, there was a very heavy link with a young winger from Hearts. And Kelvin, I believe you might have had a small part to play in this if we put 2 and 2 together and maybe get 4 or maybe get 5.
Well, I wouldn't want to big myself up too much, Martin, but I'm pretty sure I did have a small part to play in it. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I did write to the club about this lad it was about 93, 94. I'd been speaking to a scout about him, and he said, write to the club, and they might send me out scouting him. And it was Alan Magic Johnson. I was living and working up in the Scottish borders. I had a couple of good friends that were big Jambo fans. I started occasionally going to Tynecastle with them. And roundabout, it was in I think the 93-94 season, this young lad made his debut. And oh my goodness, every time I saw him play after that, he just did something that made you think, if that's all I saw in the game, it was worth the entry fee. He was an absolute flyer. He'd 2 feet. He could, if he was playing on the right, he could take you inside and out. If he was on the left, he could do the same. And when they played him up the middle, he just was an absolute flyer. What he did lack, he was slight of build, but by gummy, good shift. I think his nickname in the Hearts, with his Hearts colleagues, was Sticky. They called him Sticky for 2 reasons. One, he was as thin as a stick, and 2, if they gave him the ball, it stuck with him. So this lad had caught my eye. Oh, I must have seen him play about, easily 10, 12 times. And I really felt like he was built for... I could have seen him flying down our wing for sure. And as I say, I spoke to a scout about him, a lad that was doing a bit of scouting for Sunderland, and he advised us to write to the club. And I did. The problem being at the time, and isn't this, that revolving door of coaches and managers that we went through. And one of the symptoms of how that's really bad for clubs is things like this, things like people flagging a good player up, get lost in all the carry on that's going on. And I think it was the point round about the point at which Mick Buxton took over from Terry Butcher. Was about the time that I wrote to the club about him. So Mick Buxton didn't instruct these scouts, or didn't go himself to see Magic, as we all called him, play. There doesn't seem to have been very much happened until Reid himself saw him play. And one of the things I hadn't realised until I started looking into this a bit more, Alan Johnson's agent or manager was a guy called Mike Morris, and him and Peter Reid were allegedly pretty good pals.
Quite good friends.
So whether they'd done, yeah. And there was a very sort of famous game where Johnson scored a hat-trick at Ibrox against Rangers, and Reid apparently was in the ground that night watching that game, and then came back and watched him again in April 96, and he watched him play at Tynecastle, a game I was actually at, and Johnson scored the winner in that game, a 2-0 victory for Hearts against Rangers. The thing was, this lad was performing against top players. If you look at that Rangers and Celtic team at the time, they were 2 teams that they could come over the border, come down south, and do damage down here. So he wasn't just performing against lesser teams. He was, in fact, there was a theory amongst the Hearts fans that he only really strapped his boots on against the big guns. He had a great record against Hibs. He seemed to love the big stage, loved playing at Ibrox, where he was a Rangers supporter. He'd gone there as a boy. He was quite open about that. He had been through the Rangers Boys Club and then landed at Tynecastle Boys Club, and that's how he made his way through the Hearts system and into the Hearts first team. So he was just a lad. When I first saw him play, would he be 18? Possibly. An absolute flyer. And people say this, and you'll have heard it before, but the first time I saw him, I thought, wow, this lad's a baller. He's going to be a great player. And I've still not changed my mind. He was a great player. He was a great player. So Reid was rumoured to be after him. I don't know if you can anybody remember that coming up?
It came up very briefly that summer, didn't it? But obviously he went to France and he went to Rennes.
I was gonna actually ask with that. Do you think it ended up not going through because it ended up being a Bosman, didn't it? Because he was out of contract with Hearts. And do you think it was the wages that turned Reedy off? That maybe or maybe that Johnson thought, I can earn a fortune going to France for a year or two?
I think that the personal terms he was offered, because originally he was going to Strasbourg, he was offered personal terms that Sunderland just couldn't match. Crystal Palace and Chef Wed were after him as well, but I don't think any of those teams could match the personal terms that he'd been offered initially at Strasbourg, and then there was a right hoo-ha. And that transfer was, it fell through because Strasbourg accused his manager of greed and trying to renegotiate the agreement at the very last moment, saying that his manager had asked for 50% more than what had initially been agreed. I mean, Mike Morris's right of reply, I haven't been able to find anything from him about whether that was correct or not, but very quickly he ended up then going to Rennes. And Peter Reid, certainly, he said that he was really interested in him, but the personal terms were beyond Sunderland at that point. So off he goes to Rennes, and I can tell you, there was a right hoo-ha back at Tynecastle about that. The Hearts fans were not happy with their board for selling them. And if I always say it doesn't matter how many of them there was, they were getting crowds of about 15,000. But gee, when they were unhappy, you knew about it. It felt like about 50,000 on your back, and the board got dog's abuse for selling them because he'd really set the Hearts support alight. I mean, they were really, really into him, liked him. He had people like John Robertson. They were getting a tune out of John Robertson with Johnson playing in that team. And I think Johnny Colquhoun played with him a bit as well. I used to really like him as well. You had Johnson and Red Johnny Colquhoun flying down the wings for the Jambos. They were a good team to watch at that point, but very unhappy at his transfer. Very unhappy, and off he goes to Rennes, but it doesn't work out. He's not happy. He's unsettled. He's making noises, whether they're coming from him or his manager, about wanting to come back.
Just quickly, Kelvin, on the actual move to Rennes, because I was reading that at the same time, Scottish defender Gary Smith made exactly the same move from Aberdeen, and you wonder if Johnson thinking, oh well, another Scot has gone there, and it might kind of soften the blow, and I know someone, and that kind of bed in. But it seems like they both had a similar year at Rennes. I think, from what I was reading, Smith didn't play many games either.
It seems like there was a bit of an influx of British-based players in France at that time, wasn't it? Like Waddle had gone over. I think with Waddle being one of the first English players to go over and play in France. I think because Waddle and Hoddle went over. Waddle went to Marseille and Hoddle went to Monaco, didn't he? In the late 80s. And then Chris Macon went to Marseille this summer as well. And I think we'd wanted to get him in this summer period as well. And he went to Marseille.
Yeah, they built the path for Stephen Fletcher, didn't they?
Eric Roy way.
Hey.
But it's funny, Kelvin, when you talk about recommending players to the club, I was just triggered a memory for me because this summer, a little bit further on this week, so I think it was maybe in July in 1996, I was on holiday in Wales with my mum, dad, and sister and stuff like that, and we'd gone to see I think it was a European UEFA Cup tie or something. It was Newtown versus Skonto Riga, Latvian side, and Skonto Riga beat Newtown 4-1. And we'd gone, but I wrote to Peter Reid that summer recommending a couple of players. And I can't for the life of me remember which players they were. But I've just had a look back through the lineup, and Stepanovs, who went to Arsenal, was playing, and Marian Pahars was also playing. So Ooh. I don't think it was those two who I recommended. I think it was a lovely left-footed centre midfield player who scored a goal or two. But if he'd gotten to watch them, if he'd taken me advice and gone to watch them, you might have spotted Pahars and Stepanovs.
You've missed your calling. You've missed your calling.
I think both of us have.
But it was funny, wasn't it, this summer? Because after Peter Reid, because the season before, the start of his first full season, everyone thought, right, we've got Peter Reid as manager, and it was our first big name for quite a while. I mean, you could throw Terry Butcher in there, but that was all a bit strange. But with Peter Reid as manager, we started being linked with the Chris Waddles of the world and people like that. And I think the summer before, everyone was thinking, hang on, we've only brought Paul Bracewell and John Mullen that summer. And everyone thought it was going to be this revolution where we were going to see the squad kind of turned over and only two players came in. Then David Kelly came in further in the season. So this summer going for the Premier League, it was at this point where almost we thought, right, well, this could be a reality, because we were talking about that club call before in one of a previous episode. And I remember that summer because it was Euro 96. I remember Sunderland being linked with Karol Poborski, Ariel Ortega, Roberto Baggio. It was absolutely ridiculous, the players we were linked with that summer.
Can you remember the phone number for Sunderland Club Call?
Oh God, no, because I never rang it. I just looked at the headlines.
Oh, I tell you what, I used to ring it all the time, and I didn't realise it cost money. And then we got the phone bill, and I got an absolute bollocking. But it was 0898 12 11 40 was the number. I still remember it, obviously now. The best one was when there was it flashed up. For people who don't remember it, was on, you had the teletext page, didn't you? So it was flashed up with this, effectively an advert for all of the clubs. And it just had a single line of a transfer rumour or something along those lines, didn't it? And I remember there was one day it said, it might have been this pre-season we're talking about, 96. It said, Sunderland land international striker. So I'm like, fucking get in. Sit on the telephone. And you go, hello, welcome to Sunderland Club Call. Today on Sunderland Club Call, we will catch you up on the new international striker that's signed. But first, let's hear a report from the Charlie Hurley Centre about how the grass has grown. And they did all of these stories, didn't they? Until you've been sat there for 12 minutes and you go, I'm invested now. Like, I'm in now. I can't turn back. And I'll always remember the international striker that we signed was a lad called Stephen Grant from Athlone Town.
Yeah.
And I think he was international due to the fact that he came from a country that was a national. So I don't know, but it was such a disappointment. And the longer it went on, my hopes were dwindling. I was like, they wouldn't drag this out if it was somebody good, but you had to stay on the line once you'd committed. But, the telephone bill was big
because and it was because it was the same summer that Shearer made his move to the Mags for 15 million, and that you could you could just see the difference because we broke our transfer record with Quinney for 1.3, and that was the difference.
Yeah, it was a significant difference, wasn't it? But we were linked with an awful lot of players, and obviously Alan Johnson, as we say, went to Rennes eventually. We ended up playing David Kelly on the wing, who was our previous record signing before Niall Quinn had come in, because I think we'd signed him for 900 grand from Wolves, but we'd had to pay another 100,000 because we got promoted, despite the fact that he was injured for the majority of it, and he scored probably 2 goals, I think, hadn't he? But really actually transfer listed him at the end of the season. He wanted rid, but nobody would take him for the sort of money that we paid for him. We eventually, I think he did a decent job on the right wing. We certainly played out of position, but we always work hard. But come the last sort of closing stages of the season, you get towards transfer, because I think transfer deadline day then was, the old one wasn't, it was the end of March. Mm-hmm. So you could make transfers all the way through. We signed Jan Eriksson, hadn't we, in January, and he played 1 game against Aston Villa, then was put out to the cold, which I think Reid often made sort of snap judgments on players, and once he made his mind up, he wasn't for turning. But that ended that window, we'd signed Chris Waddle and Alan Johnson. So Johnson obviously hadn't settled in France, and he came back in. And of course, Alan Johnson, he played on the right, didn't he, for that last sort of closing stage of the season. He scored the last goal at Roker Park in a league game.
His debut as well was against Newcastle, and I think it was Waddle's second game and David Kelly's last game, if I remember rightly. Unfortunately, I was very excited, but unfortunately, I was on holiday, so my protege's debut I missed, and I would have liked to have been there. But my brother was there, and he said he played really well on the night down at Newcastle. So 4 games he plays. You're right, Martin.
I thought you were going to tell us, Kelvin, that for his debut, you were back in the Gallowgate end, which is your usual tactic.
Well, the away fans banned, weren't they, that game?
Yeah.
There was. I know that there was a few Sunderland fans in the crowd. My brother definitely went to that one. Probably it was easier for us to, if it was an all-ticket game, it was always easier to get tickets for the Newcastle end, living where we lived at the time. So, yeah, he arrives at an interesting time, for sure, for the club. Waddle's arrived. He's he's coming to the end of his career, but he's a known Sunderland fan, which helps him, and, everybody's got high hopes that Waddle's going to do the business, and he comes. At one point, I was thinking we'll see Magic careering down one wing and Waddle careering down the other, but he didn't play Waddle on the wing, did he? He played him behind the forwards in a creative role behind the forwards, didn't he?
Well, but that was basically wherever Waddler was walking, he was basically saying, just give him the ball. Wherever Waddle was on the pitch, whether he was standing next to Perez or whatever, he was just give him the ball. Give it to Waddler. But I was just going to say quickly, Kelvin, because in that huge game against Southampton at Roker Park, he got injured at the same time as Ostenstad scored their goal after 20 odd minutes. And actually, if you think the next game, we played Everton where he came on a sub, and then again Wimbledon at the end of the season where he didn't actually start when we needed a result, because he took that knock, and I think he ended up limping through the last couple of games.
Yeah, he did, and I mean it's sliding doors stuff, isn't it? You wonder, had he been fully fit, would it have made a difference? Yeah, you look back on that, and it's football. It's just football, isn't it? We were talking about Phillips taking an injury into the playoff game last week, and it's just football, isn't it? It's just the way it goes.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Johnson obviously went on to have that, those couple of seasons that he had on the left wing, playing in front of Mickey Gray. And he really hit the straps then. He was fantastic. And I think, he came to Sunderland, and I don't know where he often played more often than not for Hearts, Kelvin, but he'd come with a reputation of being a right winger, really. That was what he's sort of billed as, but he's put out on the left for us in the Championship seasons. And I kept thinking when, in that pre-season after we got relegated, I was really desperately hoping that we'd keep Chris Waddle. I thought he can still do a brilliant job for us in the Championship. First season at the stadium, I thought it was so fitting for him to play. And obviously, I think he went to Burnley as player manager, didn't he? I think that was the season he went and joined Burnley, and Gaza went to Burnley and all that sort of stuff tried to happen at Turf Moor. But if Waddle had stayed, perhaps that move doesn't come over where Johnson gets put out to the left. If Nicky Sumby doesn't come in halfway through that or just before Christmas, perhaps Johnson doesn't get that chance to go over onto the left.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was Summerby. Summerby's arrival was what shifted him to the left, and I think Martin Scott had some injuries, and
that's the other
was struggling
one too, isn't it?
Yeah, so Mickey Gray got punted back to fullback, and Magic comes in on the left-hand side.
Was that part of your scouting report, Kelvin, that he could fill in a couple of positions?
Honestly, that wherever Hearts played him, left, right, centre, he used to play centre forward. He used to play as a forward. He always did something that caught the eye and made you think this lad's a baller. He really was a fantastic young talent when he came through at Hearts. And I mean, although we played him on the left, and he had that really good relationship with Mickey Gray, the two of them. Imagine being a right back and them two flying down the wing at you. I mean, you just really want to be sure that your right hand midfield is going to help you out there, because the two of them were flying and seemed to gel really quickly with each other.
Oh, they had that sort of natural instinctive partnership and understanding, didn't they? The same as Quinn Phillips has.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to say, actually, when I remember that Portsmouth game when Martin Smith actually started it, and him and Johnson were on the wings, I think, and Martin Smith got that bad injury, and Martin Smith was flying. And it's one of these things that a couple of things that happened under Peter Reid's kind of management happened almost by accident, didn't it? When an injury happened and Reid tried something and it just came off.
But it's the same as we were talking. Who were we talking to recently? Was it on this, or was it another pod that we did where we're talking about the Gates and Gabbiadini partnership? Oh, it was on here, wasn't it? And Keith Birchin got injured. Yeah. And Gates wasn't even on the bench. I think John Moore came off the bench for Birchin. It was away at Fulham. And then next game he brings Gates in. Him and Gabbiadini play alongside each other. The rest's history. And the same thing happened with Johnson and Gray. You've got the injury Martin Smith, the injury Martin Scott, and you're kind of flying with Mickey Gray and Alan Johnson, and you don't look back. Johnson was a hugely popular player at the club, and he was fantastic in that Championship winning season. Like him and Gray down that left hand side were unstoppable on a lot of occasions. But then, of course, that summer he was going the last year of his contract. He lets Peter Reid know that I'm not going to be signing a new contract. And Reid, as I said, he once he'd made his mind up about things, he didn't change his mind, did he? And this was another example of that, because Johnson said he wasn't going to sign a new contract, and he bombed him out, and he never played for us again, did he? He had loan spells, I think, Birmingham and Bolton. But this is a 26-year-old player, prime of his career.
Yeah.
And when you look back to that summer, when you kind of look back and you go, we went up with 105 points, or whatever it was. Next season, we finished 7th. You look at it and you kind of imagine it's all like that, don't you? That summer, we lost Lee Clark because he wore a Daft T-shirt. Mickey Bridges went. And Johnson went. And those, with those three and Phillips, you'd probably say those are our 4 best players.
Well, I'll add to that as well, because Andy Melville was pretty much an ever-present that Championship winning season, and we'll let him go on a free.
And Bridges, he was kind of in and out the side. He found it hard displace Quinn Phillips, but the thinking was that he would come in and play much more of a role instead of Niall Quinn, because people didn't think Niall Quinn necessarily be able to go on and do what he did do in the Premier League. So you had these players leaving, you're kind of watching on, and that season we kind of started all right, but obviously we got stuff to Chelsea. Bridges is scoring a hat-trick for Leeds in the top flight against Southampton and stuff like that, and you're kind of going, this is potentially going to go wrong. And that Johnson decision, it's not looked back on as being a massive one for Reid because things went so well afterwards. But if things hadn't gone well for Reid, that could have been one where people look back on and really hone in on.
To be fair, if you know you're gonna bring in Stefan Schwarz and he can do a job on that left, it's almost a little bit of a shrug of the shoulders. It's a big change of system and their style of play, but it probably suited Peter Reid because he probably thought, actually, we need to be a little bit tighter in the Premier League. And actually, he probably wasn't that bothered about playing two flying wingers.
Well, yeah, I don't know, because I think if Clark doesn't go, Schwarz doesn't come in. So that's the swap there.
Yeah.
I think we end up playing a different system by default because Johnson's gone.
I think with Reid as well, a lot of the time it's about creating spirit amongst the group and also respect for him. Yeah. So if he sees you as doing something that puts that at risk, it's more important for the greater team that he puts his foot down and says, right, that's it, you're away. That was something I always felt with him.
Yeah. No, and look, it's very difficult to argue against, isn't it? Because it worked. And look, Johnson went off and he eventually did join Rangers, as you said, Kelvin. He had kind of a bit of a history with Rangers and a fan of the club. And he obviously wanted to go to Ibrox. He eventually went there in 2000. So he's kind of had a year out in the cold spells at Birmingham and Bolton on loan. But he was only there for a year and he went to Middlesbrough.
Yeah.
And he was at Middlesbrough for 3 seasons, only played 20 games or so. Yeah. So he had four years of football there where he barely played, really. And then you're looking at a player approaching 30 and he's kind of on the downhill of his career, isn't he? And it seems, when you look back on it, it was such a waste of talent. Now, I'm not saying he was to blame or anything, but just the way it worked out was such a shame, because I would have loved to have seen Johnson play in the Premier League for us. Like,
of course, he only ever played 4 games in the Premiership for us.
Yeah.
Who was to blame for that is quite hard to figure out. It was really interesting living up in Scotland, and getting all the Scottish press take on what was going on. As far as they were concerned, Reid had dished him, ostracised him. At one point, he couldn't even train with the kids. He was ostracised. In the meantime, I mean, that lad had made his international debut the season before. He was doing really, really well it's with the Scotland squad. There's a really interesting bit, at the height of the ostracisation, if I can call it that.
It's a good word.
Craig Brown gets in touch with Peter Reid and says, I know you're not playing him at the moment, but I'm thinking of bringing him into the squad. And Peter Reid says to Craig Brown, he's absolutely flying in training, get him in, and gives him this glowing report. And then in the Scottish press, Johnson's asked about his situation, and he says, I spoke to the gaffer just before I left, and we're going to speak when I get back. This was from Scotland duty, and hopefully something can be worked out. And I'm reading that and thinking, oh, great, they're gonna. But Reedy's obviously said, I'll speak to you when you get back. You're off to Birmingham, because that's where he went. It was odd, reading the Northeastern press and the Scottish press on it. But Reid and Bob Murray were really upset at him. This does seem to have occurred, as best as I can see. They actually Murray offered him a contract that had just about a 300% uplift on his basic salary. That was what they offered him, and apparently he shook hands on it, went away to Scotland duty, and when he came back, said that he wasn't going to sign it. And
Yeah.
I think Peter Reid and Murray both felt he'd been tapped up whilst he was away by Rangers. Do you know who the Rangers manager was at the time?
Walt Smith?
Dick
No?
Advocaat.
Yeah, right, there you go.
Nice.
All the connections.
Circles. We're all going in circles there, aren't we? The football circle. Yeah. But well, Johnson himself described his career as a black hole. From that point, he disappeared into a black hole and couldn't. I think there's another quote from him where he says, I just want to play football for Sunderland, but I don't want to talk about my contract. And therein, it's like Mountain and Mohammed stuff, isn't it? Reid, as Andrew rightly says, his team spirit was really important to him, commitment, and it looks like Johnson isn't committed in the long term to what's happening at Sunderland, and Reid's not gonna have that. So off he goes. And his career, you look at it after that, and it's a downward spiral. With the greatest of respect, Birmingham, Bolton, Borough, who he lands at. He does a year at Rangers, but I think injuries had impacted, and then form when he was at Rangers really difficult for him. That I think, his boyhood club and a club he wanted to. I think the whole family were he had an older brother that played for St Johnstone, Sammy, and he was a bit of a legend in Scottish football. And I think he really, really wanted to do well at Rangers, whatever the rights and wrongs of how he lands there. But it really turns into a bit of a nightmare for him, I think. And off he goes to Borough and picks up injuries, gets loaned out, and then he's away back up to Scotland to Kilmarnock and John Jeffries, who was his manager at Hearts when he came through, and things settled down a little bit for him there. I think he plays over 100 games, but he moves back into the waddler position. He's not on the wing anymore. He's playing he's playing beside the goalie and behind the forwards and wherever he feels he needs to go. So I would say I'd speak to people about Alan Johnson, and those 2 seasons where he was flying down our wing, we had a team that were giving us the kind of football that probably most of us hadn't seen in our lifetimes. It was fantastic football, and he was part of that. And I remember Kevin Phillips imploring him to sort out his contract situation. Phillips was desperate for him to get back in there and start playing again, but it wasn't to be. It wasn't to be.
Yeah. Just 2 quick things I just wanted to quickly pick up on. He wasn't involved in the pre-season, I noticed, and one of the games was obviously against Glasgow Rangers, wasn't it, at Ibrox? It was Ian Ferguson's testimonial, and if they were tapping him up, I imagine there was some interesting conversations going on between the 2 boards probably and the 2 managers at that game. We got beat 3-1. The other thing was talking about Johnson going out on loan. You're talking about him telling Craig Brown that he was flying. I don't think it was any coincidence that he ended up going to his mate's team, Bolton Wanderers, with Sam Allardyce. He probably rang Allardyce and went, "There's a player here. I want out the training ground. Fancy, he's a good player. Just take him."
Yeah. I mean, that network and Reid's network. This is aside from Johnson. His network, fantastic, wasn't it? It's amazing how often like that Mike Morris connection. You're talking about Reid or talking about a transfer, and then you see that Gary Rowell played with Reid in the same under-21 team. All these connections. He was a well-connected character, Peter Reid. But his temperament was well known. You'll remember that Bob Murray had been warned off Reid for these kind of outbursts, and his attitude at times. He could be very, very truculent and immovable. If he thought he was right, and he would stick with it. But that lad delivered he delivered some great football to it. So that's an observation, not a criticism.
And I think Mike Morris and Sam Allardyce had a relationship as well, didn't they? I think they were quite heavily connected as well. So you kind of got that little circle there with agents and Reedy and Big Sam and all the things going on. There's so much that'll go behind the scenes that we've just got no clue about. You can join some dots up, can't you? But
yeah.
I will.
If I can say one thing, without Alan Magic Johnson, Mickey Gray doesn't get his England cap.
Well,
and without Mickey Gray, Alan Johnson doesn't get his Scotland Cup.
The biggest revelation in all of this, Kelvin, did I hear right that Alan Johnson's brother played for St Johnstone?
Yes.
There must have been a decent bit of marketing there from the club's PR department. I bet they were over the moon at that.
Just another, it's not trivia, it's just a bit of information. I don't know whether you know that Alan Johnson's son is Max Johnson. He's the current flying right back for Sturm Graz, and he's going to be Scotland's next. He's going to be Scotland's next young new thing. He's in the full squad.
Well, hurry up, Kelvin. Get a scouting report sent in. Could be your next protege.
Born in Middlesbrough. There you go.
He was.
Of course, yeah.
And I am actually off to Austria soon, because I don't know whether you know, I used to be a professional skier until my career went all downhill.
Very good. I hope somebody's keeping a tally on these, and we can rack them up at the end of the series.
He's here all week.
He's here all week, indeed. We'll move on, I think. Another thing that happened on the 27th of May, this is way back in 1913, was that an investigation was apparently started into the conduct of Sunderland's captain Charlie Thomson and a couple of other people involved in that year's FA Cup final, which of course we lost to Aston Villa. And I think it ended up that he was banned for the first month of the new season, so Andrew, but what do we know about what actually happened? Because the information around it's a little bit sketchy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think when you start looking back at stories from this era, you've got a few complications. News isn't as instant as now. I mean, Club Call was a long way off, and never mind getting alerts on your phone.
It had the Sunderland Telegram service.
Yes, and do you know the number for that as well? Or I don't even know how a telegram works. I don't even know if you need a number. But yeah, news kind of came out in drips and drabs. And the other thing, whenever you're reading back from this era, the language was different. So sometimes it's hard to interpret exactly what is being said in some of these reports. They use sometimes quite florid words and sentences. But yeah, there's a couple of established facts. As you say, there was an investigation as a result of the 1913 Cup final. Our captain, Charlie Thomson, Harry Hampton of Aston Villa, and the referee, as a result of these investigations, all end up getting suspensions, and it caused a pretty big ruckus at the time.
So what was the story? What happened? Do we know what actually gone on?
Yeah, the story I think goes right back to Sunderland's early days in the Football League. At that point, it was Sunderland and Aston Villa, two of the biggest clubs in the country, You've got that excellent period where Sunderland win the title 3 times out of 4. The time we don't win it, it's Aston Villa that pip us to the post. You've then got that famous painting from Thomas Hemme, which I'm sure we've all seen in the reception area at the stadium. It's that beautiful, huge painting. That's of a game between Sunderland and Aston Villa from 1895. So these are two of the big giants from the early days of English football. The rivalry is rekindled in 1912, 1913, because not only did the two teams play in the cup final, but were both chasing the title as well. If either team ends up winning both, I think I'm right in saying that would have been the first time a team had achieved a double. And for Sunderland in particular, this is our first time in the cup final. We've wanted to reach that stage for so long. And as a result of that, the players are not, they're going full throttle in the game. They're not willing to give up this chance of being the first players to win the cup for Sunderland. So I wonder if all of that gives a bit of background as to why this game became a bit physical.
So it was the physical side of things that resulted in them getting in trouble, was it?
Yeah. You've got 3 main protagonists here. As we've touched upon, there was Charlie Thomson, who was Sunderland's captain. He's a very intelligent player. He wasn't a thug, but he was physical. You've got Harry Hampton, who has won the title previously with Villa. He scored in a cup final previously when they beat Newcastle in 1905. He's still an Aston Villa legend. I think he's their biggest league goal scorer. So they're constantly having a battle on the pitch. It's to and fro between them throughout. And then you've got this referee into the mix, a fella called Arthur Adams from Nottingham. He's quite an interesting character. From what I can gather, he was one of the better referees at the time. He had previously overseen one of our games earlier on in the competition. I don't know if any of you have picked up on this in the past, but we played Manchester City in round 2. The tie was originally held at Hyde Road in Manchester. Turns out it was bedlam, really. Full house, fans, the gates were locked early and fans are still trying to force their way in. The players are having to battle through crowds to get to the changing rooms. They're having to battle just on the pitch because you've got players and fans encroaching. Adams was the referee. His report was one of the things that the authorities reviewed and used to decide, because that game was abandoned, they then decided that it should be switched, and rather than being replayed in Manchester, it moved up to Roker Park. So you've got all these interesting people involved in it and a bit of background. Also, I think something that is, well, for a start... Oh, yes, go on, Chris.
Sure. Just quickly, Andrew, he also refereed our semi-final against Burnley that went to a replay. He refereed both of those games.
Ah, I'd missed that. But he was a busy man, and again, that just further proves the point that he was deemed a suitable choice as referee. Earlier on that season, he had refereed a couple of games in the British Championships. I think, was it called the British Home Championships then? Also involved in that, a few weeks before the final, was Harry Hampton, who was playing for England, and Charlie Thomson, who was playing for Scotland. So I wonder if, in addition to the tense rivalry between Villa and Sunderland, you've also got that England-Scotland problem rolling over into the final.
Hampton scored a goal for England by charging the keeper over the line, and that Charlie Thomson wasn't going to have that in the cup final, and it was one of the triggers, I think, I can't remember where I read this, Andrew, but apparently he wasn't going to have it. And very early at the start of the game, he was described as laying Hampton out to let him know who the boss was. And the two of them go at it, but nobody was booked or sent off for anything. It sounded like a free-for-all, the report that I read. You're right about the flowery language, trying to interpret what it is they're actually saying there. But allegedly, according to the thing, what I read, he wasn't going to have Hampton charging the goalie over the line, and right early into the game, he lays him out.
Well,
I don't know whether it was a right hook or a left hook, or
well,
thank goodness we never did it again.
What I'd read, it said he'd barged Hampton early on in one of what was called one of the worst violations of fair play ever seen in a cup final. And then Hampton kicked him back while he was on the deck, but the referee just let them get on with it. So,
these were the days where, if both players had pulled out a pistol, they still wouldn't have been booked.
I think in the referee's defence as well, he knew that this was, I mean, it's a cup final. It's going to be full-blooded. He did speak to them on a couple of occasions. As you say, it wasn't the done thing to be handing out cautions and what have you. His priority was presumably just to get the game on and keep it 11 players each. Kelvin and Martin have touched on incidents there. One thing I found quite interesting when all of this came to pass, Thomson had quite a well thought out statement that was ran in a lot of Scottish papers. He seemed to think that rather than it being a culmination of issues, he seems to think it was a one-off moment that caused the problems. That might have been one of the ones you lads have touched on. He describes it as that they both went up, they've challenged for a ball, Hampton has landed awkwardly and then said something. So his opinion was that it wasn't even because of the physicality that was thought to have crossed the line. He might just be kidding on here, trying to make himself look a bit better, but there was a suggestion that Hampton's maybe said something, again, in an era where I think gentlemanly conduct is perhaps more important than whether you've kicked somebody up in the air. He might have said something that was a bit beyond.
Well, I mean, and just a couple of things to bring into the whole occasion, and to put a bit of context into the thing. You've already mentioned, Andrew, huge FA Cup final, obviously, but you're talking, and this was like there was reports saying this is the biggest cup final that there's been because it was the two biggest sides, and you're talking over 120,000 people in this day and age traveling all over the country. And it's funny, and the other thing was, in the week leading up to it, apparently it had been torrential rain in London all week, so it made the pitch quite boggy and kind of not great to play on, which meant obviously sliding tackles and people falling over, and it just makes for a better spectacle. The other thing was, just again with the kind of the atmosphere around it, I was reading a brilliant little section from Rye Hill Football, which I love, kind of going through about the game, and it said basically about people travelling down from Wearside for the world record crowd that were gathering for the contest, and it said the invasion of London knew no ends, and Mr. Daniels, the traffic manager at King's Cross Station, indicated that all passenger records had been broken. Many carriage windows were broken on the way to Crystal Palace from King's Cross and Victoria Station, and 2 people were trampled in the melee on arrival and required medical attention.
That wasn't Thomson and Hampton, was it? They're on pitch battle.
They started at King's Cross and didn't stop until Wembley.
Yeah.
But it's the whole occasion, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And that builds up to this atmosphere, which, as I say, perhaps the referee's aware of that and thinks, look, I just want to get a game on here. If I start laying down the law, am I going to whip people up even more. One thing I think is important to mention about all of this, we're talking about it being a bit of a battlefield, and there's cartoons from the time in the papers making that analogy. You read some reports which suggest, they make it look as if Richie Pitt's tackle on Alan Clark in the first few minutes of 1973, they make out as if that would be considered a nothing tackle. And yet you look at other reports, the Football Echo, for example, they don't mention physicality. They don't mention fights. All they say about Thomson is that Thomson and his other colleagues, as it happened, defended most stubbornly. That was the term. Now maybe you could read between the lines, but there certainly wasn't an indication that they felt it was over the top. The other thing is, in midweek, you've got the two teams playing again. Sunderland get the point that mean they secure the title. In the reports I see, at no point is there any reference of any hangover or anything bubbling over there between the players. So you could argue, was some of this pearl clutching? Was this sensationalist from some reporters? Because there's just as many reports suggest that it was a pretty fair and even game. I suppose if we were to ever see footage now, you're viewing that with different eyes, and what we consider a bloodbath might not have been the case then.
I guess the thing with that is, though, that the three of them got banned, didn't they? They were all banned at the start of the next season. So the FA obviously thought there was enough in it to do something about it. There must have been enough controversy stirred up by it to act.
Well, yeah, you're right. Now, from what we gather, Sunderland lose the cup final but win the title a few days later. They go on a tour abroad. It's only when they come back towards the end of May that the investigation starts. All three are suspended. Hampton, after that, remains a regular in the Villa team. Thomson, who in 1912-13 only missed 3 games all season, one of which was because he was on international duty during these British Championship games. He then misses a month at the start of the 13-14 season and has to sit out 6 games. So that shows straight away the impact on him.
Interesting that tour that you talk about at the end of the season. So we go off at the end of the season, we go off a couple of days later on a tour of Central Europe, I think. And we played 8 games in 27 days. So imagine coming off a league season where you win the title straight into this sort of schedule of games, 8 games in 27 days. We won all of them, right? So we beat Ferencváros 9-0, won 7-0 over Vienna 11, 7-0 versus a Berlin 11. The final game of the tour came against a Hamburg 11. And this was a really, really rough game, apparently, when you read the reports. The Germans apparently didn't like Sunderland's tactic of shoulder barging or shoulder charging. And Sunderland weren't too keen on the German tactic of kicking everything that moved. Jimmy Richardson was sent off for Sunderland. Charlie Buchan said, I'm out. So he came off the field to protect his own safety because he was actually scared of what was going on. It was such a brutal game. And after the game, Charlie Thomson, so, again, if you go on the context of him being involved in this ongoing battle with Hampton and, having a bit of a reputation as standing your ground, being a very stubborn, robust defender, Thomson said after this trip, charging is not allowed, but they can kick you up in the air and bite you when they're coming down. That's German football. Every time our boys gave a good English charge, we were ordered off. But we didn't go. Next English team that goes to Hamburg ought to be fitted up with armour suits. So you've got this cultural difference and cultural style of play coming into things as well. But I think reading everything that we've found and talking about stuff, I think the charging element of it was a bit of our play, but also quite an English thing to do.
Well, being 1913, it's the timing of saying we need armour next time we go to Germany's probably a bit. Just go back to the final quickly, Andrew. I mean, just because something, you talk about the referee being suspended and the what happened with the players. I mean, looking at reports, clearly something happened because the big thing with the referee, or one of the big things with the referee, was that he apparently played almost 20 minutes stoppage time, which was almost unheard of. So clearly, and afterwards, he got so much kind of stick, or because he was suspended or whatever, he ended up retiring. So, I mean, because of that stoppage time, that's evidence that something was going on. Whether the referee played stoppage time he shouldn't have played, or something huge went on in the game where he had to stop the game and have stoppage time.
Fair. I mean, there was a missed penalty in the game. I don't think penalties were handed out as often back then. Villa's goalkeeper needed 10 minutes of treatment. And as you say, there was the 20 minutes. So, yeah, there was obviously a bit of needle in the game. I think the doubt comes as to whether that was within the acceptable terms at that time, or whether it had gone too far. You're right about the referee. That was the end of his career. I think he is probably the one who's got the worst tail out of all of this, because he's gone from this well-respected referee. He's taking charge of semi-finals, finals, international games. Then this happens. Apparently, during the investigation, they didn't even give him the courtesy of an opportunity to speak. Both of his linesmen were involved. They both stuck up for Adams, but at no point was he able to defend himself and explain why he officiated the game the way he did. And I think that's probably as much why he packed it in, because he thought, well, you've given me a suspension. I've not even had a chance to give myself a fair fight in it all.
Yeah. And I just want to say, just in case we haven't mentioned it, I can't remember us mentioning it, and we can go back to the final, but it's worth mentioning twice if we have. But in the fourth round, we did beat Newcastle after a second replay. I just thought I'd mention that. We needed to get that in.
Well, I mean, if Sunderland versus Aston Villa got a bit rough and ready, I dread to think how the referee coped with the Newcastle game. Football back then was obviously very different. So we're trying to view it with modern eyes, and that can be tricky.
Was it right that Sunderland weren't invited to play in the Charity Shield that year? Was that because
right.
we're on tour, or was that part of the punishment?
I think the stuff that I read was part of this. Our invitation to take part in Charity Shield was revoked, really.
I think we've got... Go on, Chris, yeah?
I was going to say, I think the top clubs would quite like that now.
Yeah. We've got a bit of form for it, because obviously in the 73 Cup final, we didn't take part in the Charity Shield. And again, it's that thing of, we view things now with modern eyes. The thought of a team winning the cup or winning the league and not taking part in the Community Shield as it is now, it would cause a bit of a stink, but it maybe wasn't as unusual back then.
For our third thing today that we're going to talk about and concentrate on, we had a few options. Now, we're going to let a little bit of daylight in upon magic here. We're recording this a couple of days before our playoff final against Sheffield United. So we didn't really want to talk about another playoff game in this, because the obvious one's Swindon Town on 28th of May in 1990. And look, we've talked about that in the last couple of episodes in terms of the Newcastle playoff and stuff leading up to that. So we won't be talking about that today. On the 28th of May in 2002, on 28th of May in 2002, so 12 years after that playoff final, Sunderland signed an international defender and announced it on the club website and kind of trailed it with, international defender set to be unveiled at 2 p.m. or something like that. Everyone got really excited. All sorts of names were spinning through the rumour mill, and on Club Call and stuff like that. And who turned up?
Phil Babb.
Phil Babb. Who, if you just announced Phil Babb had signed, you might have gone, oh, all right, can you sign him? I think he'd been a sport in Lisbon for a couple of years. I think his bollocks was still sore after that crash into the post he did for Liverpool against Chelsea, wasn't it? Which is, even when you see that now, that gives you a certain feeling somewhere, which isn't very pleasant. Yes, absolutely. But Phil Babb was all right. I think he kind of redeemed himself after an iffy first season. But he did not deserve the build up the club game. I think PR lesson was probably learned with that.
Would employed someone from Club Call, I
think. You've beat me to it there, Chris. I was just going to say, how much would have Martin paid to listen to the news on Club Call instead of the website?
You mean how much would Martin Starr have paid?
Yeah, fair dues. Fair dues.
It was almost as bad as when we announced we'd agreed terms with Robbie Keane, and then we hadn't. On the 29th of May in 1976, we were still on our tour down under. We beat Western Australia 2-1 with goals from Mel Holden and Bobby Kerr. And this was another friendly where people got red cards. Dennis Longhorn got a red card in that game. I couldn't find out what that was for, but must have been some shenanigans going on. While on the 30th of May in 1987, we find our last story for today. And the headline of that is Denis Smith arrives at Roker Park. Now, at the time, Laurie McMenemy had done his moonlight flit. We got relegated after the playoff with Gillingham to the third division for the first time in history. And the 39-year-old former Stoke centre-half, Denis Smith, he'd been in charge of York City for 5 years. And he'd kind of got a reputation as being a bit of maybe a cup shock manager, really. He'd led York to a few great cup ties against Arsenal and Liverpool, I seem to remember reading about. And he kind of got this reputation at Bootham Crescent of kind of upsetting the apple cart a little bit. Bob Stoker would come in at the end of the season, and you kind of look back on it and think, Bob Stoker was an old guy coming in. Obviously, 73 was a good decade or so before this, but Bob Stoker was only 56 at the time, which as a manager now, it's a fairly young manager still. And at the end of the season, he said if he was 10 years younger, he would have loved the job, but he was too old and he was going to retire. Which again, in the context of today and today's managerial ages, might kind of be surprising to some people. So on this day, Denis Smith arrives at Roker Park, but Chris, it was kind of almost the first time he was mentioned after a good couple of weeks of speculation as to who the new manager would be.
Yeah, well, I'm going to take exception with you just saying that Denis Smith was a cup manager at York because, of course, as he would be the first person to tell you, he was the first manager to break the 100
he got record
barrier.
That's right.
In the league,
in terms of getting mass understanding
agree.
of what he was all about.
Yeah, those games against Arsenal and Liverpool that they had were good for that. Still talking about in York, I think those games. But yeah, you've kind of talked about the kind of backstory there. Only Sunderland could get beaten on away goals after extra time was played at our place, where funnily enough Gillingham scored in it. But I'm sure we'll wait until that comes back around before we get into that. But I've said to you, I mean, me and you, Martin, I mean, we've talked about this a lot, and I've said to you before, and actually, interestingly, I've actually had an interview with Bob Murray that unfortunately never went out for one or two reasons. But I put it to him that this was the most important appointment he made at the club. I think we were at a real crossroads at this point because I think football was different back then. Obviously it's different then than it was now, but in terms of the gap between the divisions, and that you could easily back then, late 80s, find yourself locked into the lower half of the Football League. I mean, I think if this had gone wrong, because Roker Park was dropping to bits, we had to massively reduce the capacity at Roker Park, spending there was a big bill waiting to be paid to try and fix the health and safety. We were trying to get licenses to basically keep using Roker Park because it was deemed kind of unsafe at certain times. And if we hadn't get this appointment right, we could have easily ended up with the Hartlepools and the Darlingtons of the world for quite a long time. We could have just ended up in Division 3 or Division 4 if it had gone completely wrong. And as you said, Murray had already tried something quite emotional by bringing Bob Stokoe in, thinking, and you've got to remember actually that, the club are in massive trouble, financially, off the pitch, on the pitch. And Bob Murray, I mean, it makes me feel old because I'm actually older than Bob Murray was at this point. He was only a 40-year-old brand new chairman who'd kind of taken on this massive task of his club. And to take it on, and you think of the names that was linked with in the mid-'80s. You went through Tom Cowie, who was linking us with Bobby Robson, and, Brian Clough was getting linked every 2 seconds. And suddenly Bob Murray's in charge of this thing, and we'll find ourselves in the third division after a mess that McMenemy left behind with his midnight flit. And then suddenly he thinks, well, what can give everyone a boost? Goes with Bob Stokoe, like you said, Martin. And then Bob Stokoe says, I'm too old now. And he ended up keeping him on for a little bit as a kind of ambassadorial role for a little bit to help him out. And I think in the end, kind of Dennis Smith said, I don't really want him hanging around, because it was almost like the Alex Ferguson effect at Man United. I think he didn't fancy that around. But yeah, after he tried that, the names were getting linked in the papers. Norwich City manager Mel Machin was the bookies' favourite, but then he went to Manchester City quite soon after the season had finished. He had Trevor Cherry, Terry Yorath, Alan Clark. Bruce Rioch was also linked because that was going to be a partnership with Colin Todd, apparently, according to the papers. Bobby Ferguson, who ended up being Malcolm Crosby and Terry Butcher's number 2 years later. He'd recently been sacked by Ipswich Town, and he was heavily linked with the job, although some people thought he wouldn't take it, but there were reports that he really wanted it. Mick Buxton as well. You mentioned him earlier on. He had a good reputation of what he did at Huddersfield, and Bob Murray ended up bringing him to the club under Terry Butcher years later. He was also linked, and a big outsider with the bookies was Arthur Cox, who we've talked about on a previous podcast to come back to the club. But all of this speculation was going on. As you mentioned, certain 39-year-old York City manager, Denis Smith, who'd been a cracking centre-half at Stoke City, by the way, and broken every bone in his body while he played for Stoke City. He was on his hollybobs in Magaluf, and he was kind of with his feet up thinking, what's he going to do for the next season? And then he caught wind, and actually what he thought might happen was he was expecting that season, or that summer, to be appointed as Stoke City manager. But what happened was Frank Edwards, the chairman of Stoke City, actually had a heart attack. And all of that kind of him going to Stoke went out the window. And then he caught wind of the link with Bob Murray and Sunderland wanting him. And actually it kind of goes back to potentially a League Cup game that at Roker Park, Laurie McMenemy was manager and Denis Smith was manager of York. And that was apparently the first time where Bob Murray had kind of clocked Denis Smith as being a good manager, because they ripped us up. I think it was 4-2 at Roker. And I think Keith Walwyn tore us a new one at Roker Park and was absolutely fantastic. And after that, I think he kept tabs on him. And yeah, in that summer, Denis Smith caught wind of him going. And he said in his book, before he knew it, he was kind of being shown around Roker Park. And I quote him from his book. He said, I fell in love with the place immediately. It was one of those old-style football grounds, much like Stoke's Victoria Ground, which had an atmosphere all of its own. It was almost as if I could feel the history of players such as Len Shackleton, Charlie Buchan, and Charlie Hurley pulling me in. And I think that sealed the deal, Martin.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you kind of look back on this period, because I hadn't kind of really realised until I was looking at some stuff in preparation for this, but before Murray had appointed Stokoe after McMenemy left, he tried to get Trevor Cherry and Terry Yorath, and both of them turned him down. So Stokoe, it wasn't a master plan where he was going to bring Stokoe in straight away. He did try different options, and he went back for these two at the very start of the summer.
Yeah, well, I was going to talk about, because Bob Murray's book, he doesn't actually talk about the chase very much, interestingly enough, because there's something else which he doesn't mention in his book, which Denis Smith talks about. But actually in his book, he said, he talks about that summer. He talked about having to meet with the players because he didn't have a manager. And then he said it was a no-brainer for me to approach Denis Smith of York City about becoming our new manager. I wanted somebody who'd achieved something in his career and also knew the third division inside out. Dennis had done very well at York. He'd won the fourth division title with 100 points a few years before, and he'd followed that up with a couple of top 10 finishes in the third division. There'd also been some memorable FA Cup runs too, with a victory over Arsenal and 2 draws against Liverpool. So Dennis was comfortably my number one target. In fact, he was my only target.
I think Bob Murray likes to paint his own version of history, doesn't he? And it's always the one that's very much in favour of Bob Murray. So I think there's quite a few things where he'll gloss over the truth. I think it's very telling that there's so many bits that are in the pit. And look, back in the day, we know the media was completely different to how it is now, but the likes of Jeff Story and Jeff Brown and all these people who were working around the Northeast media, Ian Merton and people like that around that time, they got briefed on all sorts of things all day, every day, didn't they? And the Bob Murray will have wanted the media to know and the fans to know that he was on it and he was looking at managers. You mentioned Bobby Ferguson before. He's quoted as saying, Bob Stokoe. So Bob Murray, that's Bob Stokoe, who he thought should be manager. Bob Stokoe recommended Bobby Ferguson because Bobby Ferguson was somebody who Bob Stokoe knew, and Bob Stokoe tried to bring Bobby Ferguson, I think, into Blackpool as a coach a few years ago. And Ferguson said, "I'm very flattered to be linked with Sunderland, they're a legendary club in need of a lift, and I knew I could do the job. I would welcome the chance to work with Bob Stokoe, as I got on very well with him." So it was obviously being pushed as Bob Stokoe being a key figure in all of this. The day before the news about Denis Smith broke, Arthur Cox shot in to be odds-on favourite with the bookie. So somebody had a wager on him somewhere, and he'd come right into the betting book. Bobby Ferguson was the odds-on favourite for the vast majority of the time, according to the press.
Well, interestingly, you can remember that almost happening with Howard Wilkinson, where the betting kind of was cancelled on it later on.
And we all know what happened there. You don't need to read Bob's book to work out what happened there too.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking about all this going on, because actually the Denis Smith deal almost broke down and it was this thing at the time, because even though the high profile partnership between Brian Clough and Peter Taylor was there, it still wasn't really a thing that management came with a team. It was kind of a manager came in and that was pretty much it. But Denis Smith was a real team. He had Viv Busby and they were a partnership. And obviously it's sad the way it ended up kind of breaking down that relationship. But, and he ended up building that team. He ended up bringing Malcolm Crosby in and all this. But what happened was, because we were taking that team from York and Viv Busby was coming as well, York City gave us permission to speak to Denis Smith. But there was a sticking point that they then turned around to Bob Murray and said, "Okay, well, you're taking our whole management team. We want 20 grand. And this wasn't the thing then. Compensation for management teams just wasn't a thing. And I think Bob Murray just went, "Well, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying this money." And Denis Smith ended up having to be the middleman between the two parties. And he ended up kind of trying to reduce it down to 10 grand and all this. And in the end, he said in his book that he came up with this plan all on his own, that he said, well, Sunderland will pay 10 grand up front and £10,000 if Sunderland got promoted. But Denis Smith said to Bob Murray, if we get promoted, or if we don't get promoted, I'll pay that 10 grand out of my own pocket.
Yeah.
Which is something Bob Murray doesn't bring up in his book, funnily enough.
No, I say it's a version of history, isn't it? Kelvin, I want to ask you about this because you will remember this. I was going to say something else. You will remember this more clearly than the rest of us will. But obviously we got relegated. McMenamy's gone. Managers are being linked, all that sort of stuff. As a club, as a fan base, preparing for a season in the third tier, which we've never had to do before in our history. For all of the reputation Denis Smith had, and as Chris rightly points out, he's got York promoted with 100 points from Division 4, cup runs, all that sort of stuff. But that season, 86-87, York had finished 20th. They were 4 points off the next of 21, which was Bolton, who actually got relegated to the 4th division through the playoffs. Mm. So this isn't Denis Smith coming in off the back of a really successful season with York. he's had a poor season with York by the standards he's set himself. So from a supporter base, can you remember how the feeling was about appointing a manager like Denis Smith? Because he had a great reputation as a player. He was still a relatively young fella, 39-year-old, but he wasn't coming off the back of a great season.
No, he wasn't. And I think given all the names that had been mentioned, I can vividly remember one of the back pages of either the Echo or the Journal said that there'd been 100 applicants for the post, that Bob Murray had said he had 100 applicants for the post. And so our heads were spinning a bit with some of these characters, but we'd had our fingers burnt with McMenemy, big name coming in, he's going to rescue. He's the boy. And I think there was a feeling of, do we need one of these big names? Would we not be better getting somebody that, I'm generalizing here, but would we not be better getting somebody that knew that division? A good young manager to bring the team through. So to a degree, Smith sort of met that criteria, if that's what you were into. There's a lot of mixed feelings, I think, about how that was done. I always remember reading somewhere, it might have been in Bob Murray's book, that him and the only director that he had on board at the time met Viv Busby and Denis Smith somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales under cover of darkness. Yeah,
it was George Hudson,
right.
Kelvin.
Yeah, I remember reading that more recently. I have to say, not at the time. So there was, I'm guessing, I would say to you in answer to your question, there was people that were not happy. There were other people, and I would say that I would be one of them. I thought this lad could be good for us. I had a very good friend who was a massive York City fan and loved the bones of Smithy, who was working with me up in the Scottish borders, and he was crestfallen at him going. But the reverse to that was, you've got yourself a really top manager there. He's going to be a great manager. I'll tell you one of the things that always surprised me about Smith, given the type of player that he was. He really produced quite attacking teams, didn't he? The onus was never much on defence. It was always, let's get up and get at them. Seemed to be his mentality. So I think there would be, I'm generalising, but I would say there would be mixed feelings at the time. I had a little bit of inside knowledge from my pal. I was pretty comfortable myself about that appointment, but I'd really felt like we'd had our fingers burnt with McMenemy. So I was ready for a bright young thing to come in and, do the business with our team. And as you say, they came as a partnership as well. Viv Busby's role, York, with Smith, hadn't been lost on the York fans. And likewise, I thought we were getting a good partnership there to sort we out and get we back moving again. There's a hell of a lot of moving parts back then, though, isn't there? Bob Murray's books, one of the sources of information. There's so much going on at that point with the ground, with the boardroom. These players that McMenemy had bought in on contracts that had no relegation clause in them, and these guys were on a small fortune, comparatively speaking. Some of these lads, Murray had to try and sort all that out.
Going back to your recollection about the 100 applicants, Bob Murray says that. He says, we've had at least 100 applicants for the job.
Yeah.
But he says, I have nobody in mind at present. I haven't even read the applications yet. I'm waiting for Gordon Hodgson to come back from holiday to open them up.
Well, on Denis Smith's appointment, he actually said directly and indirectly, we had 90 and 100 applicants for the job, but Dennis and Viv Busby were always my number one team. They had been on holiday and I was waiting for them to return. He reminds me of his best friend, Howard Kendall, and let's face it, everyone has to start somewhere. And then he said, it's interesting because for context of going on, but he said, everything is geared for success. We have cut costs and all necessary financial arrangements are now in place. We have no financial worries at this club. Money won't come up again. And then Martin sent me an article from the 4th of August where Denis Smith gave a quote to Jeff Brown and said, by the standards I've been used to, I've got a reasonable amount of money to spend, but by Sunderland standards, I've hardly got anything.
Yeah.
Just going back to the 100 applications there, Martin. Murray claims that he hadn't even opened them. He was waiting for his director to come along and help him work through them. How does he even know there are applications in that case? They could have all been from Kelvin tipping him off about players that he's spotted. I mean, yeah, he's got friends who support York, so he's obviously heard about Gabbiadini. He's got friends who support Hearts. Next time there's a new manager chase on, just get Kelvin in and we're sorted.
Well, the other thing, because he talks about this chase apparently for Denis Smith, and Kelvin's absolutely right. He mentions that meeting with Denis Smith and Viv Busby, which he describes as under the cover of darkness somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales. But he goes on to say about that, Kelvin, he says, we had to be discreet. I was making an illegal approach to another club's manager. So, he talks about all these applicants, and I'm sure, he said in interviews that, Sunderland had a reputation with the Football Association and everything for doing things the proper way. But, when needs must, he went round the back and met them in the cover of darkness and made his illegal approach.
Alan Clark was another name mentioned. Obviously, Andrew mentioned him earlier, getting flattened by Richie Pitt. But in this piece as well, in this quote from Bob Murray, he's so firm on Bob Stokoe being a key part in the future. And he basically says, Bob's staying at the club. He's a very respected man in the town. And anybody who is not prepared to work with him will not be welcome here. Now, as far as my memory goes, Bob Stokoe was around for that third division season, shaking hands and, being pictured with sponsors and stuff like that. But after that, he moved on. And, whether, I don't know what even happened there, whether that was Stokoe's decision to go, this isn't quite right or whatever. But I think Murray was envisaging it would be kind of like a Matt Busby, Bob Paisley sort of setup with a famous former manager being a key part of the club.
Yeah, well, again, Denis Smith, Bob Murray's version of the event is that Denis Smith just didn't like him, or they didn't kind of get on, or Denis Smith kind of felt uncomfortable that he was around the place. And he said, I mean, the way he puts it was that Bob Murray actually had to talk to Bob Stokoe, and explain the situation, and just said it's not really healthy for the club. But I was going to put it back to you lot, thinking about, I mentioned that Bob Murray's a 40-year-old chairman just in the job into this absolute mess. It probably helps him if he almost has this shield of Bob Stokoe kind of on his shoulder, isn't it? To say, well, I'm basically got Bob Stokoe in, help us with all the football decisions.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. But Bob Stokoe at the time, he was suffering. He had his kind of migraines and all this sort of stuff. And I think actually the third division, the relegation to third division, really took it out of him. And I think he was quite unwell around that time. And I've spoken to a couple of people where it was literally the day after he was at Roker Park, kind of collecting all his gear, and he knew he wasn't going back in that role.
Yeah. Smith obviously comes in, Chris, to a club. We've talked about a lot of turmoil, but there was so many players. Kelvin mentioned earlier that McMenemy had signed big contracts, big reputations, hadn't quite done it. And, one of the reports I was reading again, it said, people like Ian Hesford, transfer listed, Eric Gates, transfer listed, expected never to play for the club again. Alan Kennedy, given free transfer. He had somebody like George Burley, who ended up actually not playing a league game. I think I'm correct in saying next season, because Denis Smith brought John Kay in, and John Kay was the first choice right back for the whole season. But there was an awful lot to come and sort out. And, it's dead easy to look back and go, that was easy. We won the league, the Storm, and got promoted back to the second division, one season down there. But to balance all of those, all of those high profile players, to balance all of those things that happened, to get people over the disappointment of relegation, to get people like Eric Gates playing some of the best football of his career, whilst bringing in young players like Gary Hours. Gordon Armstrong was already on the scene, but to really make him a first team regular. Richard Ord, I think, made his debut that season. He obviously brought Marco in from York, who I think Marco was scored against Sunderland in that League Cup game. I think I'm right in saying.
No, I think he came on as sub, I think, didn't he?
Yeah. But it's actually a remarkable job he did to get that whole thing settled and a team performing, wasn't it?
As you go through the points there's a lot of parallels with when we next found ourselves in the third tier. We've been in
as well.
Yeah, we'd been in the top flight a couple of seasons before. We then find ourselves down in what's considered the lower leagues. There's financial issues. There's players out of contract. There's a squad that doesn't fit. So you're dead right. For Smith to have done that and made it look so easy in comparison was a fantastic achievement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as he describes, I mean, when he's talked about it in the past, and we did a podcast with him, and he was kind of going through it, and he said he couldn't believe a club the size of Sunderland when he came into it, that basically, and it's typical Sunderland, I think, in terms of glass half empty, but he was like, everyone was telling them, we're going to go down again. And he said that's the type of atmosphere he came in at. He said everybody was rock bottom. And he said he said one of the things he had to focus on was bringing in characters. And he said he knew he needed John McPhail, because he said he saw him in a reserve game or something barking out orders to everyone else. And he went, right, I need him just to start shouting at people on the pitch. And he said John Kay, because John Kay was at Wimbledon, and he said when he spoke to Dave Bassett at Wimbledon, he said, what's he like as a fella? And apparently Dave Bassett's story was, well, put it this way, he moved from Arsenal to Wimbledon so he could move further up north. And and Denis Smith went, right, well, he'll do for me, and brought him back up to Sunderland. But I think it was about getting the characters in. I think he knew he needed to kind of lift the place. And with his experience as well, one thing he said was he saw all of these, Martin mentioned George Burley and Gates and all this, and being that player who was fantastic at Stoke and kind of went, had all those injuries and then went downhill, but with just through fitness and age. He said he took one look at George Burley and realised he was carrying a knee injury that he couldn't play on with. And it was these sort of things that he spoke to George Burley almost straight away and went, you've got a knee problem. I can see it. I can see the way you're running. I can see the way you're moving. He went, I did the same. I was trying to hide injuries. So he knew how to manage these older players because he was in that position. And I think, just asking them to do the jobs that they were there for. Because, I mean, you think about, and one thing, you go back to Bob Stokoe. I was reading about Jeff Story in his commentary about the potential of Bob Stokoe getting the job. Some of the things he was saying at the time was, some of Bob Stokoe's decisions in that running was crazy. Like was it Swindlehurst at centre half playing against the back, playing against Tony Cascarino and things like that. And so Jeff Story wasn't behind kind of Bob Stokoe coming in, and I just think we needed this type of manager to come in and freshen it up, because we had the young nucleus there of the likes of Armstrong, the likes of Hours, but we started that season with probably, you could say, top flight players in terms of Gary Bennett, Mark Proctor, Ruben Agboola, and Eric Gates as well, of course. So we had some brilliant players. It was just needed that manager to sort it out.
You're dead right, Chris. More importantly, though, I just want to congratulate you, because you were the first one to get our catchphrase in today of typical Sunderland. I was starting to panic that none of us had mentioned it. You were talking to Don Goodman about catchphrase in your pod recently, and I thought, none of us have said typical Sunderland. Yes, so thank you, Chris. You've saved us there.
It's interesting. It's interesting with how Denis Smith got that side settled, isn't it? Because even in some of the stuff I was reading, Gary Bennett, you look back, you think, well, Gary Bennett was the captain there, relegated, brought us back up. I read something immediately after relegation. Gary Bennett's basically saying, if a bid comes in for me, I'm off.
Yeah.
I want to leave. I've tried my hardest. We've gone down. I'm sorry we've gone down, but I want to leave the club. And you had all of this going on in the background as well. So for him to build up that side and get people together, and it wasn't even as if the season started off brilliantly. I think we started off the first couple of games okay, but I think come the mid-September we were maybe 9th or 10th, and it was only when we signed Marco. I think did Marco make his debut with Chester? It was Chester at home. We got beat 2-0.
Yeah,
and we'd had to sell Mark Proctor, so Proctor had gone to Chef Wed. So we cashed in Proctor, spent some of that money bringing Marco in from York for 80 grand. Marco made his debut, got beat 2-0. Was it 2-0 or 3-0 against Chester? I can't remember.
2-0.
2-0. And then down at Craven Cottage, a game that we talked about or mentioned earlier, where Keith Birchin goes off injured. John Moore comes on. There's something I think Marco scored in the first minute and towards the end. Did we win that one 2-0? But
2-0.
we kind of got in this role, and Gates come inside, and it kind of all just clicked, didn't it? And we went on this really sort of strong surge to the top of the league.
And I think again, the conversation I had with him was Dennis Smith kind of said something basically like Eric Gates had been kind of in and out the side. He hadn't really settled as kind of that first choice. And when that injury happened, and he was like, right, well, what am I going to do up front? What's the long-term plan up? Because I think it was quite a nasty injury with Birchin. He was going to be out for a while.
Fractured cheekbones, wasn't it?
Yeah. And basically he said he spoke to Eric Gates, and he was like, right, well, what job could you do for us? And Eric Gates just went, get me the ball and I'll get him in behind, talking about Gabardini. And he went, that's all we have to do. And Dennis Smith went, all right, we'll do that. And that's what they did. It was as simple as that. When football was as simple as that, you didn't have patterns of play or, fullbacks coming in of centre midfield or anything like that. It was just give me the ball. And he said by the end of that season, his calves were black and blue because basically centre halves had just gone through the back of him. But he said he rode most of the tackles because he knew the centre halves would try and come through him. He rode it, turned, knocked Gabardini in behind, and that was the third division championship winning side right there.
I wouldn't say it's an easy game complicated by idiots, don't they? That's what the phrase is.
but the other...
where's Pep? Where's Pep when you need him? Eh?
Don't get me started on Pep.
But I mean, just to kind of
that's another podcast for another day. That
just to kind of put a statement on though. I mean, I said right at the top, and I'm gonna kind of invite you all to kind of try and answer it. But I mean, maybe not at the top because you could have a big debate about it. But where would you say this ranks in terms of the most important managerial appointment in Sunderland's history? Because I've always argued that this was a real kind of turning point where I think if Bob Murray got this wrong, we could have ended up, like I said at the beginning, a Darlington or a Hartlepool for quite some time.
See, I don't think we would have gone that far. And I think you had a period of time there where clubs like Wolves, Swansea, all those good, Burnley, went down to Preston, even if you're kind of looking at that, went down to the third tier and fourth tier and kind of rose back up. And I don't think there's ever been a club as big as us. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, a club as big as us or kind of close that's kind of gone all the way down and stayed there.
I think that's true, and you'd like to think that Sunderland would have. This might sound big-headed, but come back to their natural level. The reason I think Smith being appointed was so important was because, as you've touched upon, Murray was young. He'd only just taken over. In time, he would bring us the Stadium of Light. He would bring us the Academy of Light. If he'd mucked that up at the time, you've got this young chairman who's appointed a poor manager. The team is struggling in Division 3. He doesn't then get that time to implement his longer-term changes. He had to get a quick win and the team turned around and things looking up so that people might buy into his longer-term philosophy. Putting my teeth in, philosophy.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, it's, again, I said earlier, it's really easy to look back on this season and go, or Denis Smith came in, went back up because we had good players, and there was so much more going on in the context of the club. But I think you could equally go back to that season where Reid came in and saved us from relegation, because if we go down then, who knows what the hell happens. You could look at Alex Neil coming in. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, Alex Neil coming in the job that he did. We could still be in the third tier now if he hadn't come in and done the job he did. So you can't go through these points of time where you bring the right manager in at the right time, and conversely the wrong manager in at the wrong time. We've made some horrendous appointments that have set us back, haven't we?
True.
I agree with that, but if I could throw in, we'd for looking at that period, would come through the marvellous 73, 75, 76 team, the team that went up in 79. We had Alan Durbin come in, and for some of us could see that he was on the brink of something, and then it just all goes in the despondency around the place. I mean, when they were talking about our recent years in the third division and the toxicity, I cannot tell you how desperate it was to be going to games at that time. The McMenemy era was terrible, and what followed it was pretty poor. After once Smith had gone, I felt that we were in danger again of losing our way a little bit, because of we didn't have the Stadium of Light, we didn't have the platform. We were on our way out of Roker Park. The place was falling to bits, and it was a dreadful, dreadful period that when Smith came in, and it did take him a while. You're right; it wasn't an easy start to the season. What I do think he made, in the game sliding door moments, his two signings that he made when he said he didn't have a lot of money. John McPhail and John Keir were two cracking signings for the third division. Two lads that would battle their way and who never let us down in that division, and then did a right good job when they came when we got promoted. So it was desperate times, and like going to, and I always remember somebody talking to us, and again it was that they were saying it's horrible to go to effectively third division games at the Stadium of Light, massive stadium, hardly anybody in it. It's dreadful. And I couldn't help but say, I don't want to be that person that says, I'll give you something worse than that, Try rolling into Roker Park, when blimmin' McMenemy's waving his hanky at you and bits of the bloody stand are falling down on your head, and you've got players that look like they really didn't want to be there, so I think it was a pretty crucial. But Bob Murray, when you think about it, I'm not Paul Putnam here, but I mean Denis Smith and Viv Busby were crucial signing, and then Peter Reid, he's made two cracking appointments there and delivered the Stadium of Light as well. It was desperate at the time. I cannot tell you how. I mean, to be rolling into games, I'm travelling down from Scotland, and I'm driving in the car thinking, why am I doing this? Why? I'm taking dog's abuse at home for going, I'm in the bad books, I'm disappearing, I'm started bringing the laddie, and he's like, please, Dad, I don't want to go again. Please don't take me. And I'm like, you're coming.
I'm going to call Esther Ranson.
It was tough. It was tough, and Smithy, and Busby were. I would agree with Chris that it was a really, really crucial appointment. Would we have disappeared? I don't know. I don't know if he hadn't made that appointment, and if Smith hadn't. He did catch the fan zone we did start playing football and people did start coming back. You can see it in the attendances that people, not straight away. It took a little while, but fans did start coming back and games did start to become enjoyable. I can think of a couple of defeats at that time, driving away thinking I've really enjoyed that game. We got beat, but I really enjoyed it, and that was a new one on me, given what we'd been through with not just McMenemy. I think the slide was on for a while. What was going on in the boardroom as well was, it could have gone either way. That
I was just about to say, Kelvin, because actually you could say about Denis Smith's appointment and his time at the club that, he took us all the way up to Division 1 in 3 seasons from where he picked us up. But, going from when Bob Murray took over the club in controversial circumstances and the deal he did with Tom Cowie, Barry Beatty was in the background taking the club to court. That didn't finish until 1991. Bob Murray thought if we lost that court case, we were going to end up shelling out millions, which was the money that Denis Smith could have had to spend. I mean, we're talking about some of his signings. Marco, I think, was 20 grand. John Kay was 80. John Kay was 18 or something. John McPhail was 20. So all these he did all this on a shoestring budget. And the other thing he had to do as well, again, I mentioned this to him, the amount of players he brought through, from the reserves and the youth teams, the David Rushes, the Brian Atkinson, the Kieran Brady's, the Paul Williams, the Anthony Smiths, Richard Order that made his debut that season. You had, I could keep going through them. Paul Lemon was there, but
I was just going to say he squeezed every last bit out of Paul Lemon, didn't he?
No.
I thought the next player you were going to mention was young Warren Hawke, as we've decided he's called now.
That's right. Yeah. Colin Pascoe he brought in the end of that season as well. Here's a question for you. Colin Pascoe made his debut away at York. He came on at half-time for a winger who was on loan, who only played 45 minutes.
Yeah, did he come from Leeds?
Celtic.
Or play for Leeds?
Am I right in thinking
McGinley?
Alan Hay?
Alan Hay was a left-back who Alan Hay played in that game. Remember when Marco punched the defender after scoring the hat-trick? Alan against Ipswich the following season. Alan Hay started that game and got took off in the first half through injury. That was the only game he ever played. The lad who played at York was a lad called Doug Maguire. So you were close with McGinley, Kelvin.
Yeah.
And Maguire, that was only... Yeah. He arrived to give us a bit of extra attacking impetus towards the end of that third division season, and he played 45 minutes at York and was never seen again.
And Pascoe scored, didn't he?
I think Pascoe did score in his debut.
Pascoe scored, and Sacco was the manager of York.
Yes, he would have been. And again, now you look at these connections, right? So you talked before about Howard Kendall's connection with Denis Smith. Peter Reid's connection with Howard Kendall was one of the big reasons that Bob Murray appointed Reid as well, because his admiration for Howard Kendall. You got Bobby Saxton in the opposing dugout here, who obviously came with Peter Reid a few years later. And you talk about the crowds coming back. One of my favourite facts from this season is that last game at home against Northampton, we actually won the league that afternoon. I think somebody else had drawn, I can't remember who it was, but they hadn't picked up the points, and we got promoted. We won the championship. We got promoted after winning at Port Vale the week before. On that night, it was Bank Holiday Monday, the May Bank Holiday. We had the highest crowd in the Northeast. It was given Newcastle and Middlesbrough in the top flight, and we were in the third division coming off those seasons that we've talked about. I think is a great testament to the way that Denis Smith had got the club picked back up, because he kind of got everybody back on board, as you say. The season after was kind of a consolidation season, really. We tipped into the playoffs a little bit and given it a bit of a nudge, but we hadn't, done much at either end. We'd been fairly solid. And when you kind of look at the middle bit of that season, or towards the end of that season, the crowds are low again. The people are a bit despondent. I think Marco had been sent off twice or three times. He got sent off away. I tell you, this is another good fact. he got sent off away at Oxford for punching a fella called Richard Hill, who later became our sporting director. But maybe Marco knew something that we didn't.
Yeah.
But then the game that Alan Hayes started against Ipswich, Marco scored a hat-trick, won 4-0. He got sent off then. So he actually had, I think he got a 4-game ban for that sending off. So in the space of 2 or 3 months, he'd missed 7 games, suspended. I think we brought Thomas Hauser in. And Thomas wasn't doing a great deal.
Goal machine.
It sounds like Marco was worse than Charlie Thomson for his suspensions and rough play.
But it's funny when you look back at it, right? So Marco had this spell where his temper got the better of him. The season after, when we've talked about the semi-final in the playoffs in Newcastle and eventually going up, I think Marco was never present in the league. And he was, we talk about the number of games Gordon Armstrong had played, and Gary Howes played a lot of games that season. But Denis Smith had got this group of players together and gone up with us from the 3rd division, 2 seasons in 2nd division. And then to get basically that same squad of players, you look through that squad, we added Tony Norman in place of Ian Hesford. But you've still got the likes of John Kay, Gary Bennett. John McPhail played the first game of that 1st division season at Norwich, Ruben Agbula. You can go through all of these players, Colin Pascoe, Marco, Eric Gates played those 2 seasons. Davenport came in the last season to replace him in the top flight. But you had the nucleus of the side that Denis Smith had inherited and then put together early on that carried him through to the top flight.
Just on that, Martin, 7 of the side that turned out against Brentford in the first game of the 3rd division ended up playing in the 1st division with Denis Smith.
See, that's unbelievable, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And again, Andrew's point before, where you're kind of looking at olden days through modern glasses, and it's for us, it's not that long ago, but we're talking best part of 40 years ago, aren't we now?
And you missed someone out when you said we brought Thomas Hauser in the season after, because of course we also, when Marco was out, we brought Billy Whitehurst in as well, didn't we? Which it could be a pod on its own.
Well, Billy Whitehurst came in at the start of the season from Reading, and him and Marco were paired up front. Again, going back to this point where Denis Smith never really felt, almost Gatesy kept coming back to partner him. And Billy Whitehurst went in part exchange with Ian Hesford for Tony Norman, and we signed Thomas Hauser to replace Billy Whitehurst, didn't we? And
the story behind Billy Whitehurst's brilliant, because he says they're on a summer pre-season thing, and they're in this same kind of place where Hull City are or something like that. And he says they're in different dressing rooms, they're doing all this training stuff. And he says Hull City players walk past the dressing room, and he said Billy Whitehurst walking past with absolutely not a stitch on or something like that. And he said, and basically his whole body's just black and blue with bruises. And he's like, he ends up talking to him, and he goes, "What's happened to you?" He says, "Well, I was just out last night and got into a fisticuffs with the bouncers, you know what I mean?" And so Denis Smith, light bulb came over his head and went, "He'll do for me."
I think they were trained in Maiden Castle. So I think it was Reading who Billy Whitehurst was with, and Reading were in the Northeast on the pre-season tour, and he'd been out in Durham the night before and got into a bit of a spot of bother with the local chap. So,
but
didn't Whitehurst? Wasn't this at the same time Ian Botham was doing a bit of training with the club? I think both of them had conversations with bouncers in the local area, from what I can gather.
Well, if you listen to the podcast we had with Jeff Brown, he claims that he basically screwed it up a little bit, because apparently he caught wind that Ian Botham was going to be around to train with Sunderland, and he let the cat out the bag or something. I can't remember how. I can't remember the full story. People will have to go back to the podcast to listen to the full story. But apparently he let the cat out the bag. Somebody, or he might have told someone from I can't remember what happened. But anyway, the story got out and ended up like the world's media descended on Sunderland's training ground the next day. And because of that, both of them didn't turn up. Because of that, so it was down to Jeff Brown. But I was just thinking as well, just an aside, there was 2 things I was going to mention. When you said the 3rd division, winning the 3rd division, these were the days when, remember when they got manager of the month or player of the month, the manager got like a 3-foot bottle of whiskey, bells, Bell's whiskey. It was like the gigantic bottle. And the other thing, we talked about the summer of '87, and I'm sure we might come on to it at some point, but I'm not sure it was the biggest event at Sunderland, Denis Smith getting an appointment, because obviously in July, David Bowie on his Glass Spider tour ended up at Roker, didn't he?
Hello, Newcastle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And apparently, again, just going from Bob Murray's book, he refused to talk to Bob Murray beforehand, which really pissed him off, I think.
He's no Billy Graham.
That's just what I was going to say. This is meant to be a Sunderland history podcast. We've started with Billy Graham, and now we're landing on David Bowie.
No, I think
that's a good circle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Always preferred Billy Graham. But I think, just to round off Denis Smith, because, obviously he got us up and we got relegated on the last day of the season after putting up a sterling effort to stay up. We got promoted late on in pre-season, really. We didn't know that we were going to be playing First Division football. And we had a series of injuries that kind of ruled key players out. I think we'd only signed, we signed Kevin Ball, and that was
Peter Davenport.
Peter Davenport, wasn't it? Those were the two signings that we
and
did.
then Brian Mooney later on.
Brian Mooney came in January or so, didn't he?
Yeah.
And again, he kind of had that nucleus of a squad that he brought from the third division, and we were so unlucky to go down that season.
But again, we're talking about finances. He mentioned John McPhail leaving, which he then said John McPhail and Eric Yates would have been useful. But at the start of that season, Bob Murray turned around to him and said, okay, I think he said you've got $1 million to spend or something like that, or $500,000 to spend, but no increase in wages. So if you're signing players, players have to leave. So the only way you could get Kevin Ball and Peter Davenport in was by letting John McPhail and Eric Yates leave. And the other thing was, John McPhail left after the opening day of the season because I think Denis Smith actually wanted him to have a First Division game in the top flight. And I think he would have come in handy later on in the season. But he left to go to Hartlepool United as a player coach. And his contract at Hartlepool meant he was on more money there than he was at Sunderland. But I mean, just going into the kind of the job overall he did, because I think at the end he was harshly treated at the end because of the job he'd done 100%. For us. And if you think probably 6 months before, no, maybe six, maybe a bit longer, because it was about the time, you're talking about the England job after the 1990 and people, Graham Taylor was taking over and things like that. And there was talk, Denis Smith was talked of as a potential future England manager. And, that was when he took us up to Division 1. And then he kind of starts that season badly, and he gets some money to spend with Anton Rogan and Don Goodman. And then he's out the door. Because he hadn't, we've just talked about how he hadn't been able to freshen the squad up for so long.
Yeah.
He basically had to sell Marco to rebuild the squad. And then as soon as he tries that, he's booted out the door. So I think in the end, because of the job he did, he should have been allowed a bit of grace to try and turn it around and build the new squad he wanted and turn the squad around.
No, I agree. And I think, we've talked a lot about different managers, pre this era, getting so much time to build squads and oversee change. And this was the first period of time that Denis Smith had to oversee change. And Bob Murray didn't give him time to do it. He let him spend the money. Then Bob panicked. And that was it. And I completely agree with you. I think he was really harshly done to in that scenario. And we would have been far better off over the next 3 or 4 seasons if he'd stayed in charge. Because, as Kelvin talked about there, you had, the Crosby era, which, he kind of got the job by default in terms of the cup run. Bob Murray will say that was all completely planned and a great decision, but it wasn't. Then you had Mick Buxton, Terry Butcher. You had vice versa, Terry Butcher first and then Mick Buxton replacing him. You had this role of managers coming from internally that, we obviously didn't have the cash to go out and appoint somebody from outside. And I wonder how many times Bob Murray thought, shit, I wish I hadn't done that. Because, a few months later, Denis Smith comes back with Bristol City, Andy Cole in tow, and turns us over.
Well, he said as well on the pod we did for him, at the time he was sacked, he was lining up signing Andy Cole for Sunderland.
Yeah.
And
Which again,
it's like a sliding doors moment, because he said he was lining up these players and he was getting them for Arsenal. He was talking to George Graham about him, and then goes to Bristol City, gets them for Bristol City, and they sell them for millions, don't they?
But the one that in that season, after we'd sold Marco and before we signed Don Goodman, the striker that Denis Smith wanted to play alongside John Byrne was David Kelly. And David Kelly was at Leicester, and we'd agreed a fee with Leicester, and we could not meet David Kelly's wages. David Kelly wanted £1,000 a week, and we wouldn't give him that. Move breaks down. 2 weeks later, David Kelly goes to Newcastle, keeps them up, and Keegan goes in there, and the rest of that's history. So you've got Andy Cole going into Newcastle a year later, and you a strike force of Cole and Kelly get Newcastle promoted, and they should have been our strike force, could have been our strike force. So you've got all these little bits of, what ifs and what could have beens, but those two were mightily close to being our strike parent.
Yeah.
And on that note,
Typical Sunderland.
typical Sunday. I think we'll wrap that up there. That's been good fun looking back on those things. I've learned a little bit about 1913 shoulder charges and Billy Graham at Roker Park and all sorts of stuff. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Andrew.
No problem.
Thank you, Kelvin. And we will be back next week with another episode of this, and we'll know the result of the playoff final by then. So obviously you people listening to this now know the result, but we're still in suspense, so we will find out very soon. Andrew is going to give us a couple of hints about something that's going to crop up in next week's episode.
Yes, the Billy Graham one, I'm feeling a bit bad about that because I was a little bit tight on my part. So we're going to go to the opposite end of the scale and go for a pretty easy one. Our player was born in Cork in 1936. Not that he had an Irish accent. He joined us from Millwall in 1957. And the reason we will be featuring him in the next episode is because it was in early June 1969 that he was allowed to leave the club after several years of good service and being a fan favourite. So if you don't get that one, I think you might need to brush up on your Sunderland history, maybe.
Excellent. Until then, that's all from us this week. As we say, we'll be back next week. In the meantime, keep an eye on rokerreport.sbnation.com for all of the latest news, views, opinions, and all that sort of stuff. Daily trips down memory lane. Keep an eye out on Away the podcast feed for all of the latest podcasts. There's a whole host of stuff there. We've talked about a couple that are in the bank there that Chris and a few other people have done over the past few weeks, but tons there to keep you occupied. And until we speak again, it's goodbye from all of us.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.